I remain unconvinced that anybody is in charge of anything in this world.
Neil deGrasse Tyson just challenged one of the biggest beliefs on the planet. And what makes it even more unsettling, once you actually think it through, it starts to break the entire logic behind believing someone is in control of everything. But if you think Neil's done there, just wait until you hear this.
Given what we know of science, why would religion still have any grip at all?
And that right there, that's where the conversation shifts. Because now this isn't just about belief anymore. It's about whether belief can actually hold up under what we already know. And that's the part most people avoid. Because it's easy to believe something, it's a lot harder to defend it, especially when the rules of reality don't seem to support it. And this is exactly what Logan starts to realize during the conversation. Because every time he pushes a question, Neil doesn't respond with opinion. He responds with method. And that changes everything. Because instead of asking,
"Does God exist?"
Neil reframes it into something much more uncomfortable. What evidence would convince you? And that's a completely different conversation. Because now belief isn't just something you feel. It's something you have to justify. And here's where things start to break down. Because when you apply that same standard, the one we use for everything else in life, to religion, it doesn't behave the same way. Think about it. If someone told you there's an invisible force controlling your life, you wouldn't just accept that. You'd ask questions. You'd want proof. You'd test it. But when it comes to religion, those rules suddenly change. And that's what Neil is pointing out. Not aggressively, not emotionally, but consistently. Because science doesn't make exceptions. It doesn't say, we'll require evidence for this, but not for that. It treats every claim the same. And that's where belief runs into a wall. Because it's not built to be tested. It's built to be accepted. And the moment you try to test it, things start to fall apart. Now here's where Logan pushes into deeper territory. Because he's not just asking about evidence anymore. He's asking about why people believe it all. And this is where Neil gives one of the most important insights in the entire conversation. Because he explains something people don't usually admit. Belief didn't come from understanding the universe. It came from not understanding it. And that distinction matters. Because in the past, when people didn't understand lightning, they called it divine. When they didn't understand disease, they called it punishment. When they didn't understand the stars, they called it signs. But as soon as those things were studied, tested, explained, the supernatural explanation disappeared. And that's not a coincidence. That's a pattern. And it leads to a very uncomfortable question. If everything we once called God eventually got explained, then what exactly are we calling God today? And more importantly, what happens when those things get explained too? Because that's the part people don't like to follow all the way through. And Neil does. Relentlessly. Because he's not attacking belief. He's removing the shortcuts. He's forcing the conversation back to one place. Reality. And reality doesn't care what you believe. It doesn't adjust itself to match your expectations. It operates the same way. Every time. For everyone. And that's why science works. Because it doesn't depend on belief. It depends on verification. Now here's where things get even sharper. Because Logan brings up something a lot of people think proves the opposite. The unknown. Aliens. Unexplained phenomena. Things we still don't understand. And for a second, it feels like a strong argument. Because if we don't understand something, doesn't that leave room for something bigger? Something beyond science? But Neil shuts that down instantly. With one simple idea. Not knowing something is not evidence of anything. In that line, that's where most arguments collapse. Because people treat mystery like proof. They say, we don't understand it, so it must be something extraordinary. But that's not logic. That's assumption. And Neil refuses to make that leap. Because in science, there is no therefore after I don't know. There's only, let's find out. And that mindset, that refusal to jump to conclusions, is what separates explanation from imagination. Because once you start filling gaps with belief, you stop looking for answers. And the moment you stop looking, you stop discovering. And that's where the real danger is. Not in believing something, but in letting that belief replace the process of understanding. Because once that happens, you don't just stay where you are. You fall behind. And history has already shown what that looks like. Because once that happens, you don't just fall behind. You start building your understanding of the world on the wrong foundation. And that's where things get even more serious. Because now this isn't just about belief versus science. It's about how people make decisions in real life. Because think about it. If your way of understanding the world is based on, we don't know, therefore it must be God, then what happens when you're faced with real problems, real consequences? Do you investigate them? Or do you accept them? And that difference changes everything. Because Neil isn't just talking about abstract ideas here. He's talking about how people respond to reality. And this is where the conversation takes a deeper turn. Because Logan starts asking something a lot of people are afraid to say out loud. If science explains everything, then where does that leave meaning? Where does that leave purpose? Where does that leave God? And this is where Neil does something most people don't expect. He doesn't try to replace belief. He reframes it. Because he makes it clear. Science was never designed to give you purpose. It was designed to give you understanding. And those are two completely different things. Because purpose is something you create. Understanding is something you discover. And confusing the two is where most of the tension comes from. Because people expect science to answer questions it was never meant to answer. And when it does, they turn back to belief. But here's the problem. Using belief to fill that gap doesn't actually solve anything. It just stops the question. And that's where Neil draws a very clear line. Because he's not against people finding meaning. He's against people using belief as an explanation for reality. And that distinction matters more than people think. Because once belief starts replacing explanation, it doesn't just stay personal. It spreads into education, into politics, into how people treat each other. And that's where the real consequences show up. Because now it's not just, what do you believe? It becomes, what should everyone else believe? And that's where things start to break. Because belief isn't universal. It changes depending on where you're born, who you grow up around, what you're taught from the beginning. One person believes one thing. Another believes something completely different. And both are convinced they're right. So now ask yourself, if belief alone determined truth, why are there so many conflicting versions of it? They can't all be correct. And that's exactly the point. Because belief isn't designed to produce objective truth. It's designed to produce personal certainty. And those two things are not the same. And that's why science exists. Because it removes that subjectivity. It creates a system where ideas can be tested, challenged, proven wrong, and improved over and over again. But belief often does the opposite. It protects itself. It resists change. It adapts explanations instead of questioning conclusions. And that's why it survives even when evidence pushes against it. Now here's where things get even more uncomfortable. Because Neil touches on something most people don't want to admit. The less evidence people have for something, the more strongly they tend to defend it. Think about that. Because you don't see scientists going to war over equations. You don't see people fighting over whether gravity is real. Because those things are supported by evidence. They don't need belief. But when something is based purely on belief, that's when conflict starts. That's when people feel the need to defend it, to protect it, to impose it. And that's where things become dangerous. Because now it's not just about what's true. It's about what people are willing to fight for. And that's a completely different level of consequence. Now bring this back to the original question. Is there a God? And notice something. Neil never answers it directly. Not with a yes. Not with a no. Because that's not how he approaches the world. Instead, he focuses on what can be tested, what can be measured, what can be known, and everything else he leaves in the category of we don't know, and that might feel unsatisfying. But it's actually the most honest answer you can give, because it keeps the door open. It keeps the question alive. It keeps the search going. And that's what drives everything forward. Because the moment you replace that with certainty, you stop searching. And the moment you stop searching, you stop discovering. And in a universe filled with things we still don't understand, that might be the one thing we can't afford to lose. So maybe the real question is there a God? Maybe the real question is, are we still willing to admit what we don't know and keep looking anyway?